Day on Tuesday, 13 February, with Jirair Ratevosian, who is a congressional candidate for California District 30. And I'm very excited to have him on. We're going to do a deep dive today in terms of foreign policy. And I just want to say also for any listeners a little bit about my background and what excited me so much about his candidacy. So my father was born in Los Angeles, and I grew up in the between Sacramento and Carmel. And I did my associate's degree at Santa Rosa Junior College, and then my BA at University of California, Berkeley. So my sort of formation as a human being is very closely connected to California politics, and it was very exciting when I learned of his candidacy. I received an email referencing this Los Angeles Times article that gave profiles of the major candidates for this district, and a very good point was made in the email that there is a big important issue that affects all Americans and indeed all citizens of the world pretty much, which is to do with the ceasefire regarding the war on Israel's war in Gaza. And that wasn't mentioned in the LA Times when the different candidates were profiled. But Jirair is actually the first, and I believe still so far the only candidate to call for a ceasefire. He is very appropriately calling on other candidates to do the same, but that hasn't happened yet. So I think our conversation is going to move between what's happening in Gaza and also his own interest in Armenia and what happened and is the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, and also just generally his trajectory. So Jirair, could you just give a sort of quick version of your life story? What made you decide to run for Congress, and what is your background?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that introduction, Rebecca, and good to be with you here. So yeah, I'm also born and raised here. I'm trying to remember what you said. My existence as a human being, I like that. Also was informed by my first, I guess, 25 years here in Los Angeles. My parents immigrated from Lebanon and Armenia, and they came straight to Hollywood. And they're not actors, but they came straight to Hollywood, and they called, LA was their second home, or was their new home, I should say. And that's where I was born, and I went to school here. Went to undergrad here at UCLA. It's where I first learned. I was always pre-med, so I was destined to go to medical school, but I accidentally almost took my first like poli-sci class as an elective, and the rest is history. And I think I found public health as a middle ground to advance my passion in health and medicine, but also through the lens of social, economic, political issues, which are very much how things get shaped. And so public health was a vehicle for me to do all that great stuff. And that took me to the East Coast eventually, and got a grad degree at BU, did a lot of anti-genocide work around the Darfur genocide back then, if you remember. This was like 2008, I think. Yep. And Beijing was hosting the Olympics, so we were doing a lot of advocacy work around that. And then went to the Hill and worked with Barbara Lee and State Department. But yeah, I've been really lucky. The themes have always been HIV and foreign policy for me as a major social justice issue. And as the world changes around you, you get dragged into other things, but you stay core to what you know and what you've been trained, and what drives you. Whether it's COVID-19 one day, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, etc. But that's been my life's work for the last I guess 2 decades.
And you also worked under the Biden administration until recently, right? Regarding public health and HIV.
Yes. I was a member of the transition team prior to being appointed, and that was a really dark chapter because remember, we were just coming out of a Trump administration. The Trump administration at that time had refused to do the normal transition of power things that have been the hallmark of American diplomacy. And they waited until the last, 25 days or something to formally transition the government to the transition team. But the transition team, we were working, in parallel to even, with a lack of information, but creating action plans for COVID-19 recovery, COVID-19 testing, vaccine rollout, all the things that the previous administration hadn't done. I was in charge of the international response for COVID, which included, which is unbelievable to say, but that was the time that we were living in. It included the restoration of the U.S. membership into the World Health Organization,
Wow.
joining the global COVAX coalition to implement vaccine equity. So these things that the previous administration had backtracked on, we had created those first day executive actions that Biden signed. And yeah, so then I landed at the State Department and worked for PEPFAR, and PEPFAR had morphed into a global health security bureau, very much involved in COVID-19 and other things to help with connecting public health and U.S. foreign policy priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And I left that position this past summer to come back to my hometown in LA. I'm in Burbank now, to run for my hometown congressional seat.
Wonderful. And it sounds
Yeah.
like in public health, and especially in terms of HIV, you found a way to really make a difference at the global level, and interestingly, kind of through American programs and policies. And I think that's interesting because I think of the lot of people who probably subscribe to my channel and follow me are extremely critical of America's role in the world when it comes to war in particular. So it's wonderful that there are things I think that are still America's clearly helping humanity in some ways. And I just wonder what it was like for you in Congress working with Barbara Lee on issues to do with war, like the war in Iraq. I believe Barbara Lee played a role in stopping the executive, or trying to prevent, was it executive power from expanding to enable the war in Iraq? Or could you just speak a little bit about
Oh,
that?
yeah. Gosh, yeah. So that was the war in Iraq was like around 2003, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was with her actually
Mm-hmm.
after the war in Iraq, but
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk about what we did
Yeah.
at that point. But
Mm-hmm.
Barbara Lee, she first of all, as your listeners probably know, she was the only member of Congress who voted against the first authorization
Mm-hmm.
for use of military force in 2001. This
Wow.
was for the war in Afghanistan. Only one, House and Senate.
Wow.
And then in the Iraq War, she was joined by, I forget the number, but a larger number of Democrats and Republicans, I think, who voted against that authorization. And I think that was I think Bernie Sanders even voted for that Iraq
Wow.
authorization, if I'm not mistaken. That just shows you how progressive
Right.
and forward-looking her vision was.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I worked for Congresswoman Lee, it was 12, 13 years into the war in Afghanistan, 10 years in Iraq. And there was this notion in Congress, and particularly in the progressive community and in the libertarian community, that what are the goals and objectives of this ongoing, operation? Remember, we had, regular news updates of troops being killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our mission was kind of, nebulous. The goals and objectives of these operations were constantly evolving. The Americans were not clear on why we were still in Afghanistan and Iraq all these years. So there was very much an anti-war sentiment, and she and members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Black Caucus in particular used every opportunity to stop the war, to prevent military aid for ongoing conflicts. And one defining moment was related to war powers, which we can geek out about. But Syria, if you remember the chemical attack
Right.
that President Obama said would be a red line. And there was all of this buildup, what the U.S. would do to respond, where we're going to strike. And I think she and many progressives and other Republican leaders really teamed up to force the president's hand to come back to Congress to get authorization for any military intervention in Syria. And sure enough, he didn't, and we were able to prevent God knows what, if the U.S. had entered that war, So how I think about the U.S. role in the world and apply it to the current conflict in the Middle East, it very much is informed by what I learned from the OG progressive, as she calls herself, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and the community of advocates, both progressive and libertarians, who came together during those difficult times to inject some common sense into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's hopeful. And could you say a little bit more, I think, about sort of the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch when it comes to issues of war and military force? Because it's very interesting to follow what's been going on in terms of the authorization of military funding to Israel in the recent months, where the Biden administration has there are laws in place, the human rights checks and vetting processes that this funding should be undergoing, but they're calling it an emergency and having bypassing these funds. And it gives one the sense, maybe someone who's not necessarily in Congress, that it's kind of a hopeless situation. Like the executive branch seems to almost have the capacity to make its powers unlimited, in some, maybe, but maybe not. And I just wondered, can you kind of speak to how those dynamics, what ultimately is the power of the legislative branch when it comes to stopping wars? And as a congressman, like a congressperson, what would you look to really push back against the executive branch, or if you felt that they were doing the right thing to support them?
Yeah, no, I thank you for that question. And I wish more people would focus on this. The Constitution lays out that Congress is the only branch that could declare war, and there in 1974, the War Power Resolution really laid out in detail what some of the legislative branch authorities are, and the executive branch. And I think for the most part, that has operated well. I think there's been efforts to reform war powers, to modernize it for current threats. And members of Congress from Oregon, California, even Massachusetts have been leaders on updating these war powers, rules of engagement, so to speak. But remember, the executive retains the ability. I mean, the commander the commander in chief has, the president has the sole responsibility to protect the nation, right, and to protect its citizens. Right. So he or she, hopefully she very soon, will always have the authority to, use a national security argument to do something. And we've seen that happen with some weapons transfers to Israel of recent months. By the way, that's happened in Azerbaijan and elsewhere too. It's constantly happening. So, there's legal scholars who weigh in about what's right, what's not right. But the president has that authority. What the legislative branch does is approves the authorization that the executive branch seeks to be able to declare war, and provide legal justification for the war. This is the AUMF that your listeners probably know about. And there's been an effort to repeal the overly broad 2001 AUMF, which was used as a justification for the war in Afghanistan, and cited hundreds of times since,
right,
to justify ongoing operations in all parts of the world. And this has been well documented by the Congressional Research Service, CRS, and that authorization, as some have labeled it, a blank check for war, has been so broad that it's given this authorization for the president to strike anywhere, anytime that there's suspicion of some terrorist activity. And so I think that is something that more congressional champions are needed to really reform that blank check, repeal it, as many have called for, and really bring it in line with the current wars that we're fighting. And there's been a growing bipartisan consensus. Every year, AUMF actually repeal passed the House a few years back. There was some major Senate momentum around it as well. But it's still kind of stuck. And it's because every time there's momentum, there's a global incident that happens that the president, ends up relying on it for legal justification to act. And so we're in this perpetual cycle of war. And so I believe it's time for the legislative branch to reinsert itself in war powers and carve out what they want the executive to do. And this is not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. This is about our nation's security, and it's about using taxpayer dollars judiciously. It's about
Democracy, I would
U.S.
add.
democracy. I was going to
Yeah.
say democracy and humanity. Exactly, right. And so it's in everyone's interest, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, socialist, libertarian, to have these things sorted out. And it's all happening in the context of most people not really paying attention. So, informed by my Barbara Lee experience and her great leadership on this, and seeing how she's been able to bridge across the aisle to work with some of the most extreme Republicans that we would agree on nothing else about, except for curtailing the executive branch's war powers, I think is something that I hope to continue to fill in her shoes and bring more people to the party, so to speak, so we can actually make some meaningful change.
Right. Very inspiring. Yeah, I think you make a really important point in terms of the point you made about Azerbaijan and Israel, because these are principles, right? So if wars, a blank check is given to one country, or kind of unauthorized military spending is allowed to take place, it's going to happen in other contexts. So I think the principles are worth defending, even for people who aren't particularly invested in one particular war.
That's right.
Yeah, that sounds like a very, very hopeful plan. I hope you succeed in that. I think it's worth now turning a little bit to the situation in Gaza. And one thing that's happened in recent a week or two ago was the suspension of UNRWA funding by the United States, the UK, most European countries, with a few honorable exceptions. Norway, I believe, has made a principled stand against that. Ireland as well. But that constitutes 50% of the budget for the largest humanitarian aid organization in Gaza. And they're suffering extreme famine. And I just wondered, since your background is in public health, do you have thoughts about that? I mean, maybe you could just start by, comparing it. I mean, have you come across in history or in the present any kind of crisis at this scale? And are there any sort of lessons to be learned? Any thoughts what you would do as a congressperson in terms of addressing that situation?
Yeah, Rebecca, this is, I think, a defining, chapter in American history where we'll look back, I think, 20, 30 years from now and see, like, how we all, contributed to, the situation, whether it was what side you were on, how we acted, what we did in our community, who we voted for, what our principles were. I really do. I think this is like, when I was, I think 3 or 4, we saw South Africa come out of apartheid. And I just remember as a kid reading about Nelson Mandela and his long walk to freedom. And I think this is something that my grandkids will ask about as well. Like, what did you do, Dad? What, were you on the streets, or were you in the State Department? And I really think that's how big it is, right? Just to put it in context. It's about, right now, Israel's security, Palestinian statehood, Palestinian rights, Palestinian livelihood, but it's so much bigger than that, right? But we're seeing the trickle down effects of what's happening in Iran and the Red Sea, and how the U.S. is now pulled into that, and Navy officers were killed. And so what's next? We don't know, right? I also believe that the forces at play, so to speak, are very much related to Russia and again Iran. I think Iran it connects both of these things, and the war in Ukraine. And if you kind of start mapping this out, you can think about potentially a new world order, and it feels like almost like World War III territory. And not to be too extreme about it, but that's really how it feels like. And by the way, this is not just me. When I'm on the campaign trail, as you said earlier, door knocking almost a couple hours a day, different neighborhoods. When I entered this race in June, I used to hear a lot about the homelessness crisis, about housing inaffordability, about student loans, students wanting their student loans to be repealed. Now I only hear about Gaza, constantly hear about Gaza.
Wow.
Last night I was at a rally in Pasadena, I was in a rally the Saturday before. I'm really inspired by what's been catalyzed, in mostly a young and diverse coalition of people who have diverted their energy and time and resources to this cause for justice. And I think there's so many different elements which we can unpack. But your question about the humanitarian impact is massive, massive, and it's going to be with us for decades to come. Think about not only the rebuilding that has to happen, but 70% of the civilians that have been killed are women and children. So think of, like, in terms of impact on generations of families that's going to have. Gaza, that strip of land was already one of the youngest. I think the median age was 20 something. Like, I'm not remembering the exact number, but that's probably even going to be lower now. So we have a bunch of teenagers walking around with no parents or just
Right.
one parent, and these people are going to grow up with no future, no job opportunities, no freaking house. Forget about jobs. They don't have a house. And so we are all human at the end of the day. And so what happens to that person in Gaza impacts you, and it impacts me, and it impacts all of us. And I think this shared humanity is not something that, I take, lightly, because even as an Armenian, for your listeners who were not aware, on September 19, Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh, which is this enclave that had 120,000 Armenians just outside of Armenia. They've lived there for thousands of years. One day they woke up to a bombardment campaign for Azerbaijan to reclaim what they thought were their own lands, and 120,000, nearly every single one of those Armenians had to escape, and I think over 7 days to walk to our neighboring Armenia to seek refuge, and that's a major humanitarian crisis. And so I'm informed by my own experience as an Armenian who's also been subject to genocide, what that displacement of land means, and the humanitarian crisis, because Azerbaijan had imposed a blockade, by the way, a very similar situation to what Israel had done to Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bombardment happened. So, of course, I was just drawing on my own experience, frustrated as an Armenian to respond to this. And sure enough, within a few, when October 7 happened, we were all shocked at the scale in which Hamas attacked and the lives that were killed. I expressed support for the cause of security and to defend terror, but within 7-8 days, I think on day 10 of this situation, I called for a ceasefire. I didn't realize I was one of the first in the country, let alone in this congressional race. But it was very clear that in terms of the way they were planning operations, in terms of the way this population was previously blockaded, without lack of food, access, energy, lights had turned off, what was about to happen in terms of the scale. And I think around October 17, they were talking about a bombing of a hospital and a refugee camp. And so I said, enough is enough. And I can't even believe that it's February 13 now, right, and October, November, December, January, February, 4 months have passed since I had called for a ceasefire. So the scale is enormous. It's going to cost, trillions of dollars to rebuild. I don't see any global effort now to bring Arab nations together, or to even think about what the U.S. role will be in this, and the U.S. should have a significant role in the rebuilding of it. But I know the administration is trying to have a broader conversation about peace and security and statehood, but the fighting has to stop. The fighting has to stop immediately. It has to stop yesterday, so that we can get to the negotiating table and talk about all these things.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going on and on, but just to quickly make hospital. There was a surgeon that was killed in the middle of a surgery 3 days ago that I saw a video on TikTok about. Like, healthcare providers, teachers, like scores of people have been killed, and the entire society has to be rebuilt. It's just, I don't even have the words to describe what has to happen in the next, generation to help out Palestinians.
Yeah, I actually do want to read the text of your call for a ceasefire in a second, but I also just wanted to reference
Oh,
a point that you made about, which I think is a really important one. I use the term democracy to describe, the idea that Congress should also have a role in foreign policy, because it's a very interesting point you made that when you're not going door to door, you see that your constituents, potential constituents, care deeply about this issue. Yet that's not really reflected certainly in the position of the Biden administration. And I do think there's a very strong sense of just hopelessness that that there is a way of influencing the White House, because they've decided their path. They don't really seem receptive. The disjuncture. I think a recent poll said that 50% of Biden voters believe that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. That's an incredible statistic, considering these are people who did support Biden. And so, I mean, just as a general point that there is a democratic disjuncture, a deficit of democracy, I think, in the current positions of much of Congress, including the Biden administration, and the inaction, the suspension of funding to UNRWA, and what U.S. voters actually want. And so, yeah, this is also an issue not for stopping what's happening in Gaza, as well as just for U.S. democracy, because if that's what the American people want, that's another reason for a ceasefire, right? In addition to all of the obvious ones. Yeah, and so I thought that was a very moving, your call to a ceasefire, which is posted on Instagram and various other social media. I'd encourage everyone to look that up, because it was actually a very moving call. And what was interesting to me is that it did connect your history as an Armenian to what's happening in Gaza. So I just want to read it and ask you to respond. So you said on Instagram, and I'll post the link in the show notes. As an Armenian, I know what it's like to be targeted for who you are for genocide. I know what it's like to be marginalized. I know what it's like to be displaced for ethnic cleansing. That just happened to my people 2 months ago in Nagorno-Karabakh. The international community should never stand in for the killing of innocent people just because of who they are or because they happen to stand in a line of fire. So I wondered if you could just speak. You've alluded to these connections, but sort of what it is that brings together the experience of the people of Gaza, the people of Armenia, and perhaps even the people of Israel, deeply into their history. What is it that, yeah, what motivated you to make these connections?
I think one worry that I have as someone who's been trying to navigate these communities is that there's this notion that because I'm pro ceasefire, I support Israel's cause or Israel's security, and that is absolutely false. And we have to reject that narrative. That is an AIPAC narrative, right? And so I think the line before that you didn't read was, "I support Israel's right to defend itself," right? So all countries should defend itself from terror, and so that is obvious. And so, I think we have to be more sophisticated in the way we're having these conversations, because I can be pro-Israel, but I can also be pro-humanity. And pro-humanity means stop the fighting, so we can, your justification that you're killing civilians because they're in the line of fire, because Hamas attacks, hides behind civilians, it does not hold water, because, we've learned about our painful history in responding to Iraq, in dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and look at the impacts of that. And the United States finally apologized 50 years later for its actions. Like, come on, we have to learn from our history. This is 2023, 2022. Right. And so, I think that we have to, there's a way. The other fact about this is Israel has the most sophisticated, military capabilities. They're constantly, talking about how sophisticated their intelligence services are, their detection capabilities, the military aid and support that we've given them for Iron Dome. I support all of that, but why can't that be applied to the way they're supporting the military operations right now, right? And I think that indiscriminate campaign that they seem to have had over the last several months has dangerously turned the tide on the world's view towards Israel and the Biden administration, as you pointed out. And I think that is a really sad consequence of what's happened, because Israel could have taken a high road. They could have had a more I don't want to play Monday back quarterback either, because you and I are not in those meetings right now. Right. We're not exposed to any intelligence, but just from the perspective of the people that I talk to every single day, they want to be sympathetic with the cause, but the current situation and the humanitarian toll makes it very hard to support the current situation. There's no end in sight, and there's no destruction of Hamas. There's just more and more civilian casualties,
Right.
and the hostage, and sometimes even hostages are getting killed as well. So anyway, I think that I'm optimistic that the Biden administration is doing everything it can behind the scenes, especially Secretary Blinken and his team, to bring allies together. I think that's one hallmark of this administration's approach, is to really knit together a coalition of the willing, whether they're, the fact that they're using Qatar for these negotiations and bringing in Saudi Arabia. I think with Ukraine, the way they've mobilized NATO and European allies to be leading the response to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia because it's their continent. That is something that we have to acknowledge is this administration is doing right, but we all want it to, come to a conclusion, come to a resolution, so people stop dying, and
Right.
I think but the pressure that your question about what's happening in different cities, what's happening here in Pasadena, even in Hollywood, where people had shut down the freeway last month, that's making a difference. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't vote, come out to vote. People should do research and educate themselves about different candidates' positions. But we should all be voting, because we can shape the way our representatives, the kind of representatives we elect in Congress, and who goes there to vote for military funding, vote for a new authorization for use of military force, vote for basic things like auditing the Pentagon, which I know is important to a lot of people. The Pentagon is the only department that hasn't finished an audit. Why?
Wow.
Why does the health department have to do an audit every single year, and the Pentagon is waived from that requirement? That's ridiculous. And so we need more members who think that way and who can walk and chew gum, who can fight homelessness, but also hold our defense contractors and defense spending to account as well. And that relates to current wars and current spending, as well as just overall our global footprint in the world.
Right. I think your comments underline that there seems to be like a long-term vision for peace in the Middle East it's not being articulated at this point. So hopefully leaders in the future will find a way. I wonder, can we turn a little bit and talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, which I think is something that is not very well discussed in much depth or detail in the media. I mean, people may have seen images of the ethnic cleansing, and then it just sort of faded from the headlines. Could you speak about, I mean, first of all, just what happened, and what are the long-term effects? Do Armenians have any hope for recovering their lands and territories? And politically, what can be done, particularly by the United States?
Thanks for the question, Rebecca. Yeah, so Armenians have been in a state of shock, almost for the last 2 years, since the first time Azerbaijan attacked, and then this loss of our land just in this past fall has really, honestly, people are in a state of shock. 15% of this congressional district that I'm running in,
Wow.
if not more, is Armenian. The most number of Armenian Americans, almost 1 million, here. A third of all Armenians in the planet live in this congressional district, certainly in the United States, but most of them are in this congressional district. And this is something that has them mad, frustrated, depressed, sad, connected to NGOs doing financial work, and it's really been on the forefront as they've looked at different candidates, and I hope ultimately will vote for an Armenian voice for the first time ever in Congress, right? And that's one of the key reasons why I'm running. As I mentioned earlier, 120,000 nearly of those Armenians who were living there and had thousands of years of connection to the homeland and churches and all these other Christian artifacts that were built over hundreds of years, all that had to be displaced into Armenia. So Armenia as a country now had a surge of refugees. That massive amount of humanitarian assistance is still needed. There's nowhere near the capacity that currently exists, and that's not just for their immediate needs, Rebecca. That's about their long-term integration into society, education, healthcare capacity, all the things that people need. that reintegrate. Armenia is a small country. You bring 120,000 people into almost 2 million. That's a big difference, right? That's a percentage-wise. And so those needs are ongoing. At the same time, the Armenian government is in an ongoing conversation with Azerbaijan and Turkey and the partners to organize some long-term peace in the region through treaties and other mutual acceptance agreements. And it's very clear that Azerbaijan is dead set on erasing Armenian identity. There's no other way of putting it, and to follow the news daily is hard, but because there's discussions about, Azerbaijan wants the Armenian constitution to be reformed so that there's never a mention about Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's a very difficult time, especially for diaspora, to kind of figure out what's actually happening. One thing I know for sure is that Armenia has made, and this has happened for several years now, several important moves to indicate its pivot towards the West and desperate to come out of Russia's, sphere of influence. For years, Russia was Armenia's only ally and security guarantor. And then Russia failed to protect Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh when Azerbaijan attacked in 2020.
Right.
And since then, and even prior to that, you could argue, Armenia has pivoted west. They've recently joined the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is a big deal because the Russian president visits Armenia a lot, and or used to visit, we should say. And so, I think Armenia is making signals that they want to join the Western world, that they want to promote their democracy, that they want their civil society to be protected, and the U.S. should be rolling out the red carpet. That's what I've argued. Armenia can play a very strategic role, just because where it's situated physically, to be a player in assisting U.S. foreign policy with Iran, with Azerbaijan, with Turkey, and potentially even Russia. Armenia borders all of those countries, and Armenia can be a true foreign policy partner to the West and to the United States. Our State Department doesn't see it that way just yet, or at least not publicly. Not privy to the cables anymore, but what I would do in Congress is be a part of making sure that our U.S. foreign policy reflects the recognition of Armenia's changing role and the opportunity that presents not only for the U.S. to support Armenia, for there to be cross-country participation with regards to technologies, education, et cetera, but then also key to U.S. foreign policy objectives as well. And we've never had an Armenian a Democrat in Congress. There's been one Republican in 1972, but we need an Armenian voice more than ever to help articulate these issues and make those connections, which are sorely needed, and the people of this district want and deserve. So both for the current crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenians are interested in wanting to reclaim those lands, but Azerbaijan has said is dead on arrival. But also for the broader long-term need to improve and enhance U.S.-Armenia cooperation, we need an elected official who can articulate and lead on these efforts, so that it's we can make some marked improvements in not only Armenia's future but U.S. foreign policy as well.
And would you say the U.S. has made mistakes in the past, maybe due to a lack of expertise in Armenia, or lack of ability to kind of understand the situation as you do?
I don't, I don't claim to be, an Armenia expert,
Right.
certainly more than some of the folks that we have at the State Department. But absolutely, I do. The world made a mistake. The world was silent when Azerbaijan attacked Armenia. Where was the United States? Where was Europe? Where was France? Where was, we know Russia was MIA, but it all happened within 48 hours. And this is why this is now going back to the local race. I have 10 challengers who have all placated to the Armenian community, who want to help the Armenian community. Not a single one of them have called for a ceasefire. Wow. So you can't be pro-Armenia and not stand against the atrocities that are happening in Gaza. So those things are all the same, and so that's why people have to look at these issues and understand the and call out people's hypocrisy when they see it, right? And
Right.
I believe that the U.S. and many of us were putting pressure because I had just been to Armenia a month before the attack. I
Wow.
had released the report. I had reached out to the State Department. I know that Armenian organizations here and around the world were putting tremendous pressure on the State Department to say, look, the temperature is rising. Azerbaijan's making moves. The U.S. could have stopped that.
Mm.
Europe could have stopped that. France could have stopped that, and they didn't.
Right.
And now, uh, we have to not only pressure Azerbaijan, punish Azerbaijan, sanction Azerbaijan, stop military transfer to Azerbaijan. There's a lot of FMF funding that goes to Azerbaijan. But we also have to now ensure that Armenia has security guarantees and territorial protection, because they're saying, help us come out of Russia's influence. And the U.S. has to, as I said earlier, roll out the red carpet, and because it's in our own interest to do so.
Right. And
Yeah.
you may very movingly connected the two issues of what's happening in Gaza and what happened in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. I'd like to just go back, because I am a scholar, to go back historically as well, in terms of these two issues, because
Right.
I wrote a book about the Caucasus, not about Armenia. But one thing, I lived in Tbilisi for 2 years, and so I know the history of that city, and it was a
Yeah.
major city, right, for both the Armenian and the Azeri diaspora. And I'm not aware of any sort of, if you look back, say 100 years, even before the Soviet period, they lived in peace. They lived in the same neighborhoods. There were poets who were bilingual in both languages. So I just wondered, and I think people will maybe hopefully also see parallels here between the conditions of Jews and Arabs living in Palestine before the establishment of the state of Israel. That it's not that these different peoples inherently hate each other. There are external forces. So I just wondered, though, can you? I certainly am not an expert in the conflict. Can you just kind of fill in historically what actually is it about? I mean, what is the claim? What is the justification for the violence?
You mean for the Armenia
Or
context,
yes,
right?
yes,
I think a lot of this goes back to 1915, or even before 1915, when the Ottoman Empire was dead set on erasing Armenians off the face of this earth. They had a well-documented campaign, to kill Armenians that has been labeled genocide. The United States finally
right.
recognized the genocide in President Biden's first 100 days, mind you, and there's New York Times reporting, there is ICC reporting about all of that, and I think why that was so important is because even Hitler had referred to
Yes,
the Armenians. Do you remember that quote?
absolutely. That who remembers the Armenians?
Well, who
Yes.
remembers the Armenians? And it's in the Holocaust
Hmm.
Memorial in Museum in Washington, D.C. And that's why all of this is connected. That's why we have to be fighting for ceasefire as we're fighting against the Armenian genocide, because world leaders, especially dictators, look at world events to execute their
Right.
their objectives. And so I think for Armenia, we've always had this fight for survival and recognition, to hold on to our lands, to demand recognition globally, because we were all, for 100 years, we were concerned that there'd be another genocide if we were not properly recognized and protected. And sure enough, that happened. It took 105 years for the United States to recognize a genocide. But in the meanwhile, Turkey and Azerbaijan and all its supporters had been planning this attack. And look what happened, right? And so history repeated itself, even though we've said never again, zillions of times. And so that's why, how we started the conversation, what we say, what we do, how we act globally, what our values are, and how we implement them through policy, through funding, matters, because things come back 60 years later, 80 years later. So, in terms of the historical nature of the conflict, it's about recognition for Armenians to have their land, to have their religion. Armenia was the first country to accept Christianity as a religion, is to protect their history, and it's never been about Armenia aggression towards wanting more land. It's just about protecting what we've always had. And by the way, we can do a whole other show about this, but there's an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, and
Yes,
even that's under attack now.
absolutely.
And and I think it's very much tied to what's happening now in that part of the world. So not
Right.
everybody can be a scholar like Rebecca, but people can be educated about some of these issues and see the connectivity and then fight for a government that is more representative of the people's views and more on the side of justice and peace and diplomacy. And I'm honored to be called by the peace candidate by the Pasadena Star News, and you know I take that with pride, and we should all be peace people for peace, you know, and apparently that's not true. So that's what we have. That's when we live to fight another day, and we live to educate people for another day. And I'm just really inspired by what you see. We've never seen so many people on the streets in our own country, let alone around the world, carrying Palestinian flags, carrying, you know, statehood flags. And that's really inspiring to see a lot of people who were part of the Black Lives Matter movement, the racial justice and equality movement, some from even the apartheid movement in South Africa. All of these causes are so integral and connected. That's been a nice part of, that's been, I guess, a silver lining of what we're seeing. But I hope to God that can be translated to, so, you know, a big opportunity to not only end the current fighting, but then finally get a two-state solution and bring some peace to that region, which, you know, I know this administration cares about, but it takes a lot more than just caring. It takes action.
Right.
It takes words. It takes money. It takes exerting influence, and it takes members of Congress to hold them accountable.
Very well put. It sounds like this is a time when we need people to lead the politicians and to shape their actions and policies, perhaps to a greater extent than we have at the moment. So I think as for our last question, what would can you reflect? At this point, we don't know how the presidential election is going to go. It could either be with Trump winning or with Biden. What kind of implications will that have for Congress and for you as a congressperson? Would you be able to kind of achieve anything under a Trump presidency, or could you just reflect on what are the implications of the outcome of the presidential elections for the next congressperson of District 30?
Yeah, well, you know, it's you know, I wanted to use the word unimaginable, but I don't think that's relevant because it is imaginable. It is. I think that, you know, Trump has shown that he will do and say anything to retain his power, to come back into power, and has, you know, no relationship with the truth, right? That is obvious. Anybody who you know has an open mind to understand and to read and listen to what's happening knows that. So, you know, I like your question because we do all have to think and plan accordingly, right? And you know, I think one of the most important things we can do, even before we get to a potential Trump presidency, or certainly after, if Trump is reelected, is really strengthen and protect our civil service in government. You know, there are thousands of people working in these agencies and in government who don't serve a Republican president or a Democratic president. I'm not talking about the political appointees that serve a president, but the hundreds of thousands of people who make this government work, who make this government turn the lights on and off, right? And those people have to be protected from politics. They have to be, you know, protected from, you know, whatever happens every single day, because they have to make our government work. And I think that would be a chief, you know, priority of mine if I'm elected to Congress, to be able to support the civil service, because we know Republicans want to cut their funding, they want to shut down the government. Then, you know, it would be a dream for them to shut down the government, because then Trump could do whatever he wants from the White House, and that's a scary, very scary proposition. So I think that would be number one. I think the second most important thing would be to preserve the checks and balances that we have as a country that has, I was going to say get us to the brink, but at least recover from the insurrection that happened. So protecting the judiciary, ensuring that checks and balances were happening. But then also, I think there's a need for us to It's not necessarily a congressional role, but as a role for society to protect the media, protect people like you who
Yes.
are trying to expose the truth. Newspapers, support local newspapers, support independent journalists who are asking the tough questions, who are doing the investigative journalism to shed light on what's actually happening. Because we know that Trump will attack the press on day one. He'll attack, gay people like me. He will attack disabled people, which he's done in the past. And so we as a society have to kind of band together to push back and hold true to our core values. I think, yeah, the last piece is, where something that we have less control over, but it's what the global community thinks of a second Trump presidency. I don't know if you heard, but what he said about NATO allies, he would encourage NATO allies to, if they hadn't paid their dues. I mean, how insensitive is that kind of comment when NATO right now is at the forefront of supporting Ukraine's war against Russia, right? And I worry that a big part of why we didn't see vaccine equity. This is the work that I did and my PhD was on. The reason why a lot of poor countries and low-income countries didn't have access to vaccines is because the United States didn't care about them under the Trump administration. The United States hoarded a lot of vaccines for the United States. We set on billions of doses of vaccines, and sure, that was a scary time. But if the United States was under a different kind of issue, my study shows, we would have had more global engagement. We would have had more vaccine equity. We would have had more vaccines get to people, and it's something that the United States and the Biden administration in particular took years, almost the entire presidency, to recover from, because we had to have a humility to show up back in these places at the United Nations, at the Human Rights Council, at NATO, to say that America is back, but America also, wants to work with you as a partner, wants to, pursue equity, and that means, putting you in the driver's seat. I'm talking about other countries now. So how we fall back into that and recover, that is a very scary proposition to think about. And it's all the more important why people should wake up, vote for democracy, because democracy is on the ballot in local races like mine in California, this congressional district 30, but it's also on the ballot in the presidential election. And people who complain about age should just wake up and smell the coffee, because one person is old, the other person is old and dangerous. And so those are your two options, it seems like right now. And I'd rather go with the older, more accomplished president than any other day, 1,000 times more than I would any other person.
Well, I think we could end there. I just note that description really called to mind what Obama said after Trump was elected the first time. I remember he said very memorably that we get the politicians we deserve. It's kind of a tough love thing to say, but it also is a reminder that we have a role in this. It's not that this is a fate, a prescripted event. We have a role, and we may not, regardless of the outcome of this particular election, we just need to keep fighting and keep pushing our elected representatives to really represent us, including in the context of our conversation, our desire for peace on the global stage. So I would encourage everyone to check out Jirair's website, check out his social media, and support him, donate to his campaign. And also, if you're not a California voter, there should be candidates in your constituency who should be running on a pro ceasefire platform. And if they're not, then ask them why not. You definitely have a role to play in this, and peace to everyone. All right.
Peace to everyone. Thank you, Rebecca.
Stop the recording.